This morning's Breakfast Bible Bite comes from Psalm 80, verses 8 and 9, which traces Israel's rootstock as well as our own through the beginning of the church. Verse 8 and 9 of Psalm 80 reads, "You removed a vine from Egypt, you drove out the nations and planted it. You cleared the ground before it, and it took deep root and filled the land." The metaphoric symbolism attached to the vine is both extensive and insightful throughout Scripture. In many cases, it symbolically refers to King Jesus and the basis for his earthly lineage through David. A very early example of metaphorical archetypes can be found in Genesis 49, 10 through 11. It reads, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. He will tether his donkey to a vine, and the colt of his donkey to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes." God drove out the mighty Canaanites from the land that he had promised to Abraham some 500 years earlier. Compared to fledgling Israel, the Canaanites were a fearful populace to contend with. Both warlike and courageous, these firmly established squatters had fortified the land to which they had no deed. However, they were no match for God, as he led his far feebler newborn nation into the inheritance that he had promised. God afflicted the trespassing interlopers with nature's weapons to scatter and dishearten them, allowing Joshua easy and flawless victories. All seven nations were dug out of the land to prepare the soil for the vine of the Lord. In the cities that were formerly occupied by heathens, God planted the root. The tribes of Israel were then firmly ensconced and established. The might and power of God to establish boundaries in nations should be taught as deeds, both of mercy and justice. Both need to be called to mind, to Jews and Gentiles alike, in such tremulous times, so as to build up and strengthen the human weakness of our fragile and wavering trust. The Apostle Paul, through the insight of the Spirit, gives the church this bit of clarity in Romans 11, 17 through 21. It reads, "Now some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive branch, were grafted in among them and have come to share in the rich root of the cultivated olive tree. Do not brag that you are better than these branches. But if you do brag, you do not sustain the root, but the root sustains you. Then you will say, 'Branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in.' True enough, they were broken off by unbelief, but you stand by faith. Don't be arrogant, but be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. God planted his vine on Mount Zion, but Israel built their temple on the Mount Moriah, in which to worship God. The God's prophets told Israel that their temple would be destroyed and they would be put out of the land. But why? For the same reason God put the heathen nations out of the land he had given them. We read in 2 Chronicles 33, 1 through 3. It yields clarity on this issue. Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king and reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, imitating the detestable practices of the nations that the Lord had disposed of before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had torn down, and he reestablished the altars of Baal. He made Asherah poles, and he worshipped the whole heavenly host and served them. What is worse for Israel is that they have turned their back upon God. The responsibility of Israel was greater than that of the heathen nations because God had granted them a privilege that no other nation had, which was the visible revealing presence of God's existence. My mind is left to ponder, haven't so many of us behave toward God in a similar manner to Manasseh, putting uncounted pieces of pleasure ahead of our personal covenant with our Redeemer? Has the church forgotten that it is the choice branch grafted in?